All right, boys and girls, it's 6 o'clock, so we'll get started, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you're visiting with us, thanks a whole bunch for coming our way. If you're tuning in online, thank you for doing that. We are always glad that you choose to tune in, and we hope you'll do that anytime that you have an opportunity. If you're here with us, if this is not your first time here, you know what we do each Sunday night. We started out with a song, and Jonathan is going to do that for us right now. Brother?
Come we that love the Lord, and let our joy be known.
Where you want to be. And like I said, we're glad you're here. And if you're visiting with us, and I have a couple of very special visitors up here just to my left, that would be my good friend James Hayes and his sweet wife Vera with us tonight. James is the new preacher for the Liberty Hill congregation out in Fairview, and I am so excited for him. Next week will be his first Sunday with that good congregation. And so this is his last Sunday off for a while. And I am so glad that he and Vera decided to come our way and to spend it in Bible study with us tonight. All right, Revelation, as I said, is where we're at. You know, we're on course. Of course, this is the last quarter that we'll do. We've done the near impossible, and that is cover Revelation in 2 quarters. That was the goal. Now, next week, I am going to be out of town again, and so we won't be on Revelation next week, but we're going to get through 17 and 18 tonight. Then I'm going to come back, and we're going to do 19. And we've already done 20 if you were at Vacation Bible School. That was such a very important chapter that we took 4 nights and unpacked that special chapter. And if you missed that, you can get online to our YouTube channel and you can check those out. And then, of course, our last night together, we're going to cram in 21 and 22. And so we are going to be done. So we're in a pretty good place now as we start Revelation chapter 17. Now, as we started out, we think of chapter 16, the 7 bowls of God's wrath. And as we looked at that, it took us to the end of history, and with the capital city of the rebellious nations, which is Babylon the Great, being destroyed. Now, when we start 17 here, at the beginning of 17, and going through chapter 19, what Jesus is going to do here through John is he's going to reveal the whole story, the full story of Babylon's destruction. So let's start out, let's read a few verses, then we'll make some observations. Beginning in verse 1, chapter 17. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead, a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, let's just stop there and take a look at this great harlot that sits on many waters. That's how the chapter starts out. And verse 5 identifies this great harlot as Babylon the Great. She is Satan's third ally. Now, the first of those allies we've already looked at back in Revelation chapter 13. The first was the sea beast, and that is the one that's usually just called the beast. And just as kind of a reminder there, when we talked about the beast, we're talking about the anti-Christian political system. Now, of course, during the first century, that anti-Christian political system was Rome, and Satan was using the might of that system, using the political might of Rome to intimidate Christians. Christians were being persecuted. Christians were being prosecuted because they just wouldn't conform to the state demands, all kinds of state demands, but particularly demands such as emperor worship. And so intimidation was being used. The second ally was the land beast, and this one is called the false prophet. We looked at it. We talked about that. A symbol of false religion, particularly, of course, in the context of the first century, Roman false religion. And now Satan would use false teachers and false religions to deceive the people of Christ, to lead them away from the one true God of heaven. And then the third ally here we come to, she is the great harlot, that is Babylon the Great. And what this is symbolic of is the culture of Rome. This is Roman culture, and what this culture promoted was the pursuit of things like wealth and things like pleasure and things like fame and things like power. And it promoted those things above all else. Now, as we look at this, and so in other words, Satan is using the culture to seduce Christians and lead them away from God's plan for his people. And so as we think about Satan's allies, we think about those 3 approaches that Satan takes. He tries to intimidate God's people. He tries to deceive God's people. And he tries to seduce God's people. It was true in the first century. It's true in the second century. And in the third and the fourth and in the 21st. Satan's tactics really haven't changed. He still uses agents and he still uses allies. And those are the 3 things that he's trying to do as he tries to rip us from God, seduce us away from God, deceive us away from God, and intimidate us away from God. Now, as we think about that, let's take a closer look at Babylon the Great. That is, let's take a closer look at the great harlot. Now, the term harlot by itself is instructive. It informs us that really her business is really all about seduction. I mean, that's what the word and the imagery of being a harlot is all about. But not only does that term tell us that she's all about seduction, but if you look at verse 2, you can see that emphasized as well. Her seductive nature is emphasized there as it talks about that she gets the residents of the earth drunk with the wine of her immorality. So again, the seductive nature of her work is being emphasized there. If you get down to verse 4, you'll also see the seductive nature of her work being emphasized, because it says there in verse 4, she has this gold cup, and that gold cup is just full, it says, of abominations and the unclean things of her immorality. And so all of those things together, that's what the great harlot, that's what Babylon the Great is all about, the seductive nature of culture. Now, if you look in verse 3 again, you'll see the harlot sitting on a scarlet beast. In verse 4, it says, it describes her clothing and it describes her accessories as well. It says she was clothed in purple and scarlet. And she was adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. Now, as you think about those things, it's a really impressive sight. I mean, if you were to see her, it would certainly get your attention. And it would certainly be something that would, when it comes to most people, they would find it incredibly impressive. Because when we think about the clothes and the description of them here as purple and scarlet fabrics, those were the colors of the rich. Those were colors of royalty. And then, of course, gold and precious stones and all these jewels. We were talking about things that are very glamorous, things that are very sophisticated. And so you see her, and she's exuding power, and she's exuding confidence, and she's exuding prosperity, and she's exuding the allure of sexual pleasure and the lure of luxury. And man, I'm telling you, that is an enticing combination for human beings. It's always been an enticing combination. The lure of sexual pleasure and the lure of luxury. And that's what she is all about here. And so it doesn't surprise us then to discover that her influence, man, it's strong. It is great. And you can see that in verse 1 because it says here, she sits on many waters. Now, this is one of those moments where we don't have to go, well, what's he really talking about here when he talks about many waters? Because when you get down to verse 15, it says, and he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And so it's emphasizing the vast multitudes that have given themselves over to her, that have found her to be persuasive and worthy of following. Her dominion and her domination over humanity is vast. Most of humanity she has seduced. That's the point that this is emphasizing. It is seductive and it is powerful. Both of those things, sexual pleasure and all of this prosperity, all of this luxury, is very appealing, and most of humanity have, as I said, has pursued that, and so in a very real sense, she rules over the masses of the world. Now, who specifically then is this? What culture is this referring to? Well, for the first century readers, the answer is obvious. It would be talking about Roman culture. Anytime we've seen any aspect of these descriptions of the beast and now of the harlot Babylon the Great, they would identify all of these with the Roman world in which they lived, the Roman political system, the false religions of Rome, and also the seductive power of Rome. I mean, who else can be described in verse 18? Take a look at it. The woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. I mean, if you're talking to a first century reader, who else? I mean, what other city can that be? I mean, this is the zenith of the Roman Empire. And so it wouldn't even enter their minds that there would be some other option out there. The great city that reigns over the kings of the earth, this is Rome. And if there's any doubt about that, all you got to do is look up at verse 9. Verse 9 says, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And it was a well-known geographical fact that the city of Rome was built on 3 hills. In fact, a lot of ancient authors and poets would use that figure as they would describe Rome, the place that is on these 7 hills. And so there's no doubt who this is referring to in the immediate context and for the first century readers. But of course, it doesn't mean that it's not applicable to every other generation, because it is applicable to every other generation. Because the principle here is timeless. Satan didn't just use agents in the first century. Satan uses agents in every generation, and the agents are always the same. The coercive power of states and politics, the allure of worldly cultures, the deceit of false religions. All of those principles are relevant to every age, and it's the same here. But it raises the question, why describe Rome as Babylon the Great? What's the point there? Well, of course, when we think about Babylon the Great, of course, we're talking about that great empire that was located in the area of Mesopotamia in the ancient world. And if you know anything about Babylon historically, and most of you do know something about Babylon from a historical perspective, it was a uniquely powerful and influential city in the ancient Near East. It was an educational power. It was an economic power, just incredibly prosperous from an economic perspective. It was the political and the religious capital of literally one of the greatest empires that the world has ever known. And not only was it known for all of those things, its political might, its religion, its education, its prosperity, its economic power. Not only was it known for all of those things, but it was also known for its moral corruption. That was just a significant part of its ancient identity. Now, of course, when it came to the people of God, and when it came to the Jewish mind, Babylon was like the great enemy of the people of God. Why? Why would the Jewish mind identify Babylon as this historic, awful enemy of God's agenda? Do what? Yeah, the captivity. Remember, it was in 586 BC that the Babylonians came riding into town, and they absolutely leveled Jerusalem, and they bulldozed the temple. And then they took the people that survived, and they took them back into captivity, basically. And there they remained for in the neighborhood of about 70 years or so, until Babylon eventually became a footnote in history because of the Persians, and Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back, and that Jerusalem was rebuilt, and the temple would be rebuilt again. But the Babylonians, they were the ones that just wrecked everything. And long before the Babylonians came to town and were actually God's instrument in dealing with the rebellious Israelites, it was prophesied for a long time that there is going to be coming from the north. There's that God's people, because they were so stubborn and they were so obstinate, and they just never would maintain their allegiance and fidelity to God, that there was going to be consequences. And that consequence came in the form of one of the most vicious armies that the world has ever known. And it was just a massacre. And so when it came to the Jewish mind, Babylon was synonymous with the most despicable anti-God people that ever lived. The most despicable anti-God country that was ever on the face of this earth. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that John would use that, but the Spirit through John would use that, as he's talking about the great enemy of God's people, that he would use the imagery there of Babylon. And so that's the symbol. Babylon's the symbol for everything that was against God and everything that was against God's people. And again, as I said, for the first century readers, that was Roman culture. But it is, as I said, is a symbol for every worldly culture that promotes the same thing that Babylonian culture that Roman culture promoted, and that is the pursuit of fame and fortune and power and pleasure and comfort above all else. The promotion of those things as the highest goal. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with being comfortable. There's nothing inherently wrong as being prosperous. There's nothing inherently wrong with pleasure when it's found within the context of God's will and God's character and God's agenda. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. So I didn't say they promote things like comfort and prosperity and pleasure. I said they promote these things as the highest goals in life, the most important things in life, the greatest things to pursue. And so with that in mind, take a look here at verse 6. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. As we think about the agenda then of Babylon the Great, of Roman culture or of our own culture, our own very secular culture promoting the same ideas, seducing the people of God away from the pursuit of God, what this reminds us of is that Christians will resist the seduction. Most of the world will surrender to it. Most of the world will buy into it. And most of the world will pursue those things above all else. But Christians won't. Those who have given themselves to God, who belong to God, who are holding on to God, who are full of faith, they will not be seduced. And because they won't be seduced, they're going to suffer. Because they won't submit their thoughts and their actions to the harlot's sovereignty, because they resist that seduction, they're going to be persecuted. And Satan is going to make sure of that. And we could spend, the rest of the time together just bouncing from place to place in the New Testament that emphasizes the reality of that. You resist Satan's seductive call, you will be persecuted. You will suffer. There are going to be consequences. Not there might be consequences. There will be consequences if you truly resist. If you truly resist. If you authentically resist. There are going to be consequences to that. Now, with that in mind, we come here to verse 8. And as we come to verse 8 through verse 11, we come to what a lot of scholars believe is one of the most difficult sections in all of the book of Revelation to really understand. And some of the details are pretty tough to understand and try to interpret with any amount of certainty. But the great thing is, and I've said this from time to time, we might not get all the details right, but we understand the meaning of it. And we understand the gist of it. And we get what is being said here. So let's take a look at verses 8 through 11. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which is wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are the 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast which was and is not, and himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. who have not yet received a kingdom. They received authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. Okay. Let's take a look at this. And as I said, I'm going to might get some things wrong here as far as the details go. But the overall message, we won't get that wrong. The overall message is crystal clear. And when he says the beast you saw was and is not and is about to come, there's a couple of different ways that pretty popular approaches to interpreting that expression. Was and is not and is about to come. Some see that as suggesting that what he's saying to his original readers is that there was a time when the beast was very powerful, and the power and the persecution that was brought to bear against them was intense. It was. But they're going through a law now to their benefit. And the persecution is not as great right now. He was and is not. You know, we know that's the case throughout human history at different times and different places. Oftentimes when Christians face persecutions, there'll be an intensity of it, and that may persist for a long time. But then it may subside for a while, and they may catch a break. And they may go through a period where they don't have to, worry about an intensity of persecution. And then later on, it may ramp up again. That's just the nature, the cyclical nature of human history. And it's certainly true, and that might be the idea here. And he's just saying, listen, things are going to get worse. Don't get lulled into thinking that, okay, things aren't quite as bad now as they used to be, but it's going to get worse. That might be it. I'm a little bit more inclined to see it a different way. I'm a little bit more inclined to see it kind of in the way that we looked at, that we saw things in chapter 13 and verse 3. If you look at chapter 13 and verse 3, we see the beast from the sea here, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. Now, if you were here when we talked about that, the idea here was that it looked like the beast had a mortal blow. It was in fact, it said it was a fatal wound. But now the fatal wound was healed. How does a fatal wound heal? Well, just it's imagery. And I said the idea seems to be that it's referring to, we know what happened at the cross, and we went to the New Testament and we looked at some of the descriptions of what Christ came to destroy, the work of Satan, and he came to destroy Satan, and he accomplished that at the cross. But suddenly now, as the readers of Revelation, and as every subsequent generation, it's like, oh, wait a minute. It looks now like as though Satan has fully recovered, and not only fully recovered, but is thriving. And that seems to be the idea here, that the fatal wound is healed. That Satan was supposed to be defeated, but it doesn't look like he's defeated. And I think, I just have a sense that that's the same idea that's being expressed here. Satan was. And then the idea that he is not. That Christ defeated him. But now he apparently has recovered. And he's recovered from that blow at the cross, and he's recovered from the resurrection of Christ, and he seems to be completely unaffected by the victory of Jesus. It seems that he has triumphed over Christ, and that he has triumphed over the church. If you just look at the world, it seems like he's won. You know, he was thriving, but Christ came and defeated him. But now look, was and is not and is to come. I kind of think it's the same idea that is being expressed there. And it says, those who dwell on the earth, these are earth dwellers. In other words, these are unbelieving people. These are unbelieving idolaters. These are the ones who are deceived into worshiping the beast that we read about back in chapter 13. And it says, and they're also described as those whose name had not been written in the book of life. These are people of the world. And it says, they will wonder when they see the beast. Now, when it says wonder, it doesn't mean they scratch their head and go, I wonder about him. No. This is wonder in the sense of marvel, admire. They're filled with wonder in a worshipful sense here when they see the beast. This one who was and is not and who is to come. But then we come here to verse 9. And we see, here is the mind which has wisdom. So you've got these non-believers as they wonder. They're filled with wonder and awe at the beast. They're not in any way protected from Satan's deception. They can't withstand it. They just buy into it. Satan easily drags them along. But Satan can't deceive the people of God. These are the ones, believers are protected by the power of the Lamb. We're not deceived by the beast. We don't worship him. And this protection is expressed here in the idea of having the possession of wisdom. Here is the mind which has wisdom. In other words, we recognize lies. We recognize it because God in his grace has revealed truth to us. And so we recognize the lies and we won't be deceived by it. And so I think that's the idea here in verse 8 especially. But now when you get to verse 10, oh my, I'm looking at the clock. I got to pick this thing up. We got to pick this thing up. When you get to verse 10 here, there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. A lot of people are really confused by this, and they're trying to figure out, what are some of the specifics of Roman history that this is dealing with, and so you'll find a lot of proposals to that. And the problem is, all of the proposals that people offer are full of problems. And so I think the idea, I think that suggests that John really isn't commenting on historical specifics here. And we're trying to find out who he's talking about here. It's symbolism. It's symbolism. And we've talked about numbers and the importance of numbers in the book of Revelation and how numbers like 7 symbolize completeness. And I think the best way to understand this is that John is saying that the beast has basically ruled over the entire history of fallen humanity. The beast has been in charge since Genesis chapter 3. But here's the emphasis. The time for his rule is short. It's coming to an end. And that's why it says, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. It is coming to an end. He doesn't have long. The end, as far as from God's perspective, the end is at hand. 5 of the 7, it says, have already fallen. And so he says, the one who is yet to come and must remain a little while shows that, look, the church, it's not done yet. The church still is going to endure some suffering. The church still has some hardship that it's going to have to go through. The persecution is not over, but it's coming to an end. And so that's the main thing that we have to remember here. The point that's being made is God's people have to continue to be prepared for a period of just intense persecution, but it's coming to an end. And so here's the point. The point is that verse 8, take a look at it, about the beast. He's about to come up out of the abyss. Here's the key words. and go to destruction. Look at verse 11. The beast which was and is not, and to himself an eighth, is one of the seven. And here goes. This is what you got to keep in mind. And he goes to destruction. Verse 14, these will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb, this is it, the Lamb will overcome them. Verse 17, for God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose. God has put it in the hearts to execute his purpose. And it says, last words of verse 17, the words of God will be fulfilled. The message to God's people is this: don't be seduced. Endure persecution. Resist the seductive lure of making pleasure and fame and fortune your chief pursuits. Resist that seduction, because it's going to come to an end. That system and everyone who follows that system will come to a screeching halt. And that brings us then to chapter 18. Questions, comments, observations on chapter 17 before we super quickly look at verse 17. Yes, Kevin.
The wording there in verse 8, the beast that you saw that was and is not and will ascend, it's hard not to think of the description of Jesus, the one who was and is to come.
That's right.
And he may look invincible.
Yes.
But he's not, because, like you said, he's going to destruction.
Yeah.
Christ was and is to come. He's never being defeated.
That's
He's
exactly
never
right.
coming to an end.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And that's a good point, that when you see those words, you can't help but to think of a very similar application to the words of Christ. And that is exactly right. He looks invincible, but he is going to be defeated. Whereas Christ looks defeated, and he is invincible, and he will win. Jay.
I might be stretching it here, but like in verse 11 when it says is himself also an eighth and is one of the seven, is that like saying, maybe referencing the eighth king of the earth, or is it reference the part of destruction where he's like king over hell?
Okay, Jay asked about, if you didn't hear him, he asked about verse 11 where it describes the beast as the eighth, also an eighth, and is one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. I don't know. But it's a great question, Jay. It is a great question. It is emphasizing, though, as you kind of point out. And, as we think of kind of the imagery of the seven and Satan's just complete dominion over fallen humanity from the beginning, Satan is certainly over that. And so there's some way that all of that's certainly tied together, absolutely. But, be more specific than that, it's just, I don't know. His power, he looks invincible. His sovereignty looks just undeniable. And yet, as it says there in verse 11 after that, and again, these are the key words in all of that, he goes to destruction. That's the key. He goes to destruction. Yeah, as I said, these verses, honestly, in verses 8 through 11, they are some of the, recognized as probably some of the more difficult in the book of Revelation to really do some pinpointing things. But the great thing is the message is, the point of the message is there in the midst of it. Sorry, I really can't, unfortunately, have a better answer than that. Anything else? All right, let's real quickly look at chapter 18. And I mean real quickly, as in 4 minutes, quickly. It starts out this way. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird." So it opens with an angel who reflects the glory of God, who's announcing, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." The imagery here, it comes from the prophet Isaiah. If we had time, we could look at that. Although it hasn't really happened yet, it is so certain that it can be spoken of as already being done. And so it gives us a glimpse of what Babylon the Great really is, what this worldly culture really is, and that is, it looks amazing from the outside. It looks like it is teeming with every good thing of life, beauty and energy and pleasure, but in reality, it is the haunt of demons. It is full of defilement, it is full of death, and it is an absolute reminder that humanity has been completely trapped in that seduction. And what you have in verse 4 is God's people are commanded, "Come out." I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out from her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues." Don't be seduced. It's the same things that we're seeing in verse 17. Be different from the world. Don't share in her attitudes. Don't share in her values. Don't share in her behavior. Judgment is coming. The sins are piled as high as heaven, verse 5 says. "For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." And so God is going to pour out all of his judgment. And so it's this dramatic picture of Babylon's fall. And what you then have beginning in verse 9 and going through verse 20 is, and you can go back and you can read this on your own when you get home, is you've got this lament. She's been so admired. Babylon the Great has been so admired for her beauty and for her wealth and for her power. And now she's been totally destroyed. And you've got these human laments from kings to merchants to seamen because they all trusted in her. That's what they put their hope in. That's where their heart was. Everything that was good in life looked like they could get from her. And so that's why they pursued her. And it ruined them. It ruined them. And so they fixed their hopes on human power and culture. And it just was, just completely left them disillusioned. Now, of course, verse 20 shows the contrast of those laments. "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her." There's going to be lamenting as God pours out his judgment on the evil systems of the world, but there is going to be rejoicing in heaven. Don't live for the world. There's nothing ahead. There's nothing in store for you except grief and lament. Live for the things of God. And so that basically is the point of chapter 18. In a nutshell, it's basically saying, and you can kind of see it in verse 21 when the strong angel comes and takes a stone like a great millstone. It says, "and threw it into the sea," saying, "so will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer." We could go to Jeremiah. We could see imagery like that. It's emphasizing the utter, complete annihilation, ultimately, of this system. The picture of the millstone being cast into the sea. Her destruction is going to be permanent. It is going to be absolutely revocable. And so the point again is this: don't be seduced by the world and what it has to offer. It is going to eventually be gone. It is going to be all gone. And the judgment that God is going to level against the world is going to be well deserved, because the world has done everything in its power to destroy God's servants. And God is going to respond. So don't be taken in by the world's promises. The world's promises look awfully good. But those who are seduced by those promises are destined to be destroyed with her. All right, so ends chapter 18. Didn't do it in 4 minutes, but I got it in 5. Thanks for being here. Now, as we end tonight, we always end with an invitation. We want to do that. And you know, every chapter that we have studied from the book of Revelation just lends itself perfectly to an invitation. It's just a reminder that the only hope that we have is in Christ, that Christ is going to be victorious. And so if you've never put on Jesus Christ in baptism, we want to give you that chance now. If you've wandered away from Christ, understand there is your only hope. Come back to Him. If you need to do it in a public way, please do it, because we'd like to pray with you and for you. And so if you have a spiritual need that you need to take care of tonight, why don't you do it right now while together we stand and while we sing.
I have found a friend in Jesus. He's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. The lily of the valley, in Him alone I see. All I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow He's my comforter, in trouble He's my stay. He tells me every care on Him to roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul.
Thanks again for being here tonight, especially our visitors. Thank you very much for coming. If you haven't had an opportunity to partake of the Lord's Supper, that's still available to you. After the closing prayer, you can just go through this door here, take a right at the hallway, and just follow it straight down to a big room down there. We call it the tea room. You'll find someone there to serve you that. Let's bow. Father, we are thankful that we could come together tonight. What a pleasure it is to be among your people, to be thinking about you and your things. Father, I pray that our hearts have been open to your word tonight, and that, Father, we have been reminded that the only hope is in you. I pray that we will not be deceived by the world. It looks so good, and it seems to promise so much, but Father, we know the truth, and I pray that we'll all embrace the truth, and each day hold on to you. We know the day is coming when you will vindicate yourself and you will vindicate your people because of Christ. And we throw ourselves on Him and His work, Father, and we offer this prayer in His name, and we say,